Hello and welcome to our webinar on teaching history in the age of AI. My name is Anna and I'm part of the team at Oxford University Press, and I'm joined today by three of our Oxford history authors who I'll introduce shortly. But first, we'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many lands on which we meet today and to recognise their continuing connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples here today. And we'd also like to note that this webinar includes images and names of people who have passed away. So next, just a quick overview of today's webinar and some housekeeping. So our three expert Oxford history authors will take you through parts 1 to 3, sharing their insights and advice on teaching history in the age of AI, and we'll then end the session with a quick Q&A. So if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A section on the right-hand side of your screen. And if we don't get to your question in time, we'll follow up with you via email instead. And finally, I'd just like to quickly introduce our three brilliant presenters and authors. So today we have Bernie Howitt, Alex Neave, and Rachael Riley, and all three have a really strong background in history education, both as teachers and as authors, developing syllabus resources that include the new Oxford History for New South Wales, Stages 4 and 5. So I'll now pass over to Bernie for part 1.
Thanks, Anna. And I think I want to start with talking about there's three big questions I think we need to look at. I'm just doing the introduction to set the context for what the girls are going to do. But where are we? How did we get here? What do we do? They're the big questions, I think, in the teaching history in the age of AI. And I can tell you that the next slide has changed, and it's changed almost daily of what to start with. And so where are we today? Well, I got us up to last Saturday and I thought I've got to cut this off. But I woke up on Saturday, as probably many of us did, to a headline under the White House releases video promoting Justice the American Way featuring Hollywood actors, and read the article that, the White House officially released a 42-second video promising justice the American way for Iran. In a separate article, The Guardian's film critic describes the AI-generated video as a piece of supremely nasty mischief, summarised it as a chilling social media video that's beyond irony. Clips from the movies are crassly interspersed with real kill-shot footage of the attacks in Iran. And if you look at the bottom here, that's the source of the video, the White House government, official government. That's the official source. And so I think that whole approach, that's just last Saturday, and it could be any day in the past week. To look at that historical context, I have stolen from the new edition of Key Features of Modern History coming out next year. Trump's campaign to make public statements without evidence has created distrust in traditionally reliable sources such as news media. Additionally, the uses of social media and AI to spread misinformation have further clouded the reliability of information in the public sphere. And if you haven't seen that video, it's a mishmash of unattributed appearances by actors and Pete Hesketh and actual footage of bombing in Iran. And that creates this situation. What do we trust? How do we trust? And as I want to look at over the next couple of slides, where we've got to is a situation where we've got students saying, well, how do we know what's what? And I think that's where we suddenly find ourselves as the gatekeepers to the reliability and trust in history and historical sources, and teaching students what to do. That's what I think we're really about today. And I just discovered that I was working across different time zones, and the day it all changed is in Australia. It's Saturday, the 21st of January, not the 23rd. It was the day after Donald Trump had been first sworn in as president. And I would argue that this is the day that everything changed for us as history teachers. And you may remember Sean Spicer, if you've lived through it all. He was Donald Trump's press secretary. for a little while. No one's had the longevity that Catherine Levitt's had this time round. But he gave his first press conference and he spoke about, he got up to defend President Trump's claim that his inauguration had drawn the largest crowd. And we remember all this. He said there'd never been a bigger one, and we've heard that ad infinitum over most everything. But the media in 2017, in January 2017, jumped on that claim, and they looked at photos, which was the most obvious thing to do. They compared Trump's inauguration to the previous two with Obama. They drew on a whole range of different sources, and they said that, you know, what Spicer was saying was actually inaccurate. So they challenged that right at the start, that on that 21st of January. And then looking back at it from April, Alexandra Topping, writing in The Guardian, you know, pointed out that after the inauguration, Spicer inspired the hashtag SpicerFacts for his reiteration of that crowd. And she runs through some of the evidence they used. Photos, crowd experts, TV ratings, the Washington Metro Network resources. And Spicer still said this was the largest audience to ever witness an inauguration period. In face of the mounting evidence to the contrary, he declared, sometimes we can disagree with facts. And from that moment on, we always had to have a response when any student said, hey, well, we can disagree with that. Who knows that's what? And that's been the challenge. And it got worse later that night when Kellyanne Conway went on to defend Spicer, one of Trump's aides, on NBC. And she used the term we've become so familiar with, alternative facts, to support his argument. And from that moment, you know, alternative facts became a widely used term. And it's increased the level of difficulty about how to clearly ascertain what's truthful in source material. And that's why I think on that day, the 21st of January 2017, everything changed for us as history teachers. And it, in the worst case scenario, it empowered students to say, well, what would you know? How do you know? What do we have to do to be certain? That's what good students were doing and asking those questions. And that's really the starting point of, I think, of where we are today. But how did we get here? This is a very, very abbreviated. It keeps getting cut back in slides and cut back in slides. But I wanted to start with Alan Turing. Back as far as 1945, he had a report on intelligent machinery. So we didn't even have the word artificial intelligence. That had taken another decade. Then he proposed the Turing test 5 years later, as people were working on this machine intelligence, answered most of the common objections to the idea that machines can think. And in 1956 was the first time that the term artificial intelligence was used for that conference there of IBM, a summer conference on AI. So it was the 40s and 50s where we sort of got started. And quick jump into the 70s when computers become increasingly familiar. I know that when I was writing one of my books, I was looking at I was using a story from the Sun newspaper in Sydney in 1957, where they had to use the term an artificial brain because they didn't have the term computer. They just didn't know what to call it in for people reading a newspaper. And by 79, by the end of the 70s, we've got the Stanford cart. So, and these three are just three things I've picked out to take us to the end of the 20th century. So we had a vehicle that could go through a chair-filled room autonomously. By the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, we had the US military using AI for logistics and solve those sorts of problems of moving supplies and personnel around in the Middle East. Where are we back now? Now we're, within the last week, the Trump government has cut one AI program out because they wouldn't let them, use it on their own people or use it to autonomously send bombs without any human input. And then 97, that's what, and this was probably the one that disturbed most people when the Deep Blue chess machine defeated the world champion in chess, and that everybody thought, well, the robots are coming. So 2015, what seemed to be the good guys, these are the issues, 15 years into the 21st century. Hawking and Musk and dozens of others signed an open letter on artificial intelligence calling for research on the societal impacts of AI. So that's just over a decade ago. July that year, an open letter to ban the development and use of autonomous weapons, signed by Hawking, Musk, Wozniak, and 3,000 researchers. So a decade ago, that was becoming a big issue. And, he will return, Elon Musk will return in a couple of slides and think he was one of the good guys. Jump ahead to 2022, we've got ChatGPT, an open AI invention that debuts in November of 2022, praised for its knowledge-based, deductive abilities and the human-like natural language responses, but it's criticised, and I didn't realise this was an AI term until I researched all this, that its tendency to hallucinate, which is a phenomenon in which an AI responds with factually incorrect answers with high confidence. And you may be ticking off some of your students right at this moment. And now you know what they're doing. They're actually hallucinating. So in November, there's a lawsuit against Microsoft, GitHub, and OpenAI, which alleges copyright violation by the GitHub Copilot, which is trained on public repositories and trained on authors' work without providing attribution. And that, I think, is really one of the big problems we have to deal with. So 2023 has been cut back significantly, but just to run through it fairly quick, there's a lot going on. ChatGPT hits more than 100 million users. On March, a petition of over 1,000 signatures signed by Elon Musk, Steve Wozniak, and other tech leaders calling for a 6-month halt to what the petition refers to as an out-of-control race, producing AI systems as creators cannot understand, predict, or reliably control. So just, 3 years ago, a lot of the high flyers are saying, hang on, we've got to pause everything. In May, there's a statement on AI risks. So people are getting worried. And they're saying things like they produce the message that mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks such as pandemics and nuclear war, so that's the sort of thing that's starting to creep into public consciousness of, what can happen. In September, things start getting a bit more serious. And you have to remember that which regime is in power in Washington at this moment. When I say there's a growing anxiety about the dangers of AI, and the US Senate holds a bipartisan, remember that word, AI Insight Forum, bringing together senators, CEOs, civil rights leaders, other industry reps to familiarise senators with the nature of AI. That leads to Biden signing an executive order on the safe, secure and trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence. Then in November, Elon Musk launches his chatbot Grok. And Grok will turn up again very shortly. They have the first global AI safety summit to be held in Bletchley Park, which is a link back to Alan Turing all over again. Discuss the near and far term risks and possible control frameworks. So we're starting to look at a global control of what's going on. And the US, China, and the EU issue a declaration to start calling for international cooperation to manage challenges and risks of artificial intelligence. So we're starting to worry what's happening. Now, let's go to last year, February 2025, change in government in America. There, UK and US refused to sign this a declaration on inclusive and sustainable AI. 61 countries meet to try and get it sorted. July, Musk announces improvements in Grok. Some changes withdrawn after the chatbot gave anti-Semitic and other responses praising Adolf Hitler. Within a week, it was demonstrated to occasionally research Elon Musk's views before providing its answer to a query. And they're the sort of issues that we do have to deal with. Later that month, Gronk Imagine released with capacity to create 6-second videos from text prompts. The spicy option allows the generation of images and videos of nudity and sexualized content. And he launches Grokpedia as a challenge to Wikipedia, and it's met with claims of unreliability and misleading information and sources, which is not what we want to hear as teachers. But just to give you, just for me to get a George Harrison quote in, and to say there was some good in there, Pope Leo was calling on technologists to build machines that embody love, justice, and the sacred dignity of every human life at their core. So there was some good news. Till this year, now Elon's back again. Grok caused a major uproar in January, giving users the capacity to create non-consensual sexualized images of women and children. Just what we need in the hands of kids. In January the 10th, Indonesia becomes the first country to block access to Grok, and in Jan 26th, the European Union launches an investigation into Grok and X's recommender systems. And suddenly then, Saturday, January the 24th, we see the world that we're living in put into place. There's the brief timeline. Alex Preddy is filming ICE officers in Minneapolis. His phone, and a woman's pushed into him. 3 minutes later, he's pushed to the ground and shot 10 times. Witnesses are taken away by ICE officers held in a nearby building for several hours before being released. Following that, Stephen Miller, Trump's number one man, tweets, a would-be assassin tried to murder federal law enforcement and the official Democrat account sides with the terrorists. And I've updated this to have now former Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem then comes out later that night saying, fearing for his life and those around him, the agent fired defensive shots. She accuses Alex Preddy of being an individual who arrived on the scene to inflict maximum damage on individuals and kill law enforcement. That is a day that historians are going to be dealing with, and their official sources that they've been given. Now, this was an article on the 24th. Kristi Noem's under fire for issuing misleading incendiary information, claimed immigration agents killed an armed Minnesota protester because he wanted to massacre them. The language has now become a source of controversy in the Trump administration. White House officials are blaming Customs and Border for furnishing inaccurate information, while others are targeting Stephen Miller and top Trump advisor. 6 sources with knowledge of the situation told Axios. So there's our problem with how do we get factual information? Who decides what's factual information? So this is where I think we've arrived at. We work and teach a history in a world of alternative facts where sometimes we can disagree with them. A world where official sources use AI to create narratives to support political ideology. A world where an image, real or artificially created, or a rumor can circulate globally in seconds. It's a reality supported by private companies and governments developing artificial intelligence to replace many activities previously done by humans. These can include planning lessons, creating written responses to questions. It can assist historians and journalists wanting a speedier result in understanding what is contained in a massive file or archive of information and records. So that leads me to ask, what do we do? And I hand over, I can do context, but I'm handing over now to 2 very well qualified and outstanding teachers to tell you what we should do.
Thank you, Bernie. I mean, disclaimer, I don't know what we do in full, but I also feel like I should start by saying that, I'm Rachael Riley and I do use AI, and I recognize that many people who have logged on are using it potentially in different capacities and sit at a really different place in their attitudes towards it. You might be excited by it or feel existential dread or be somewhere in between. And even at your schools, there might be really different approaches. I know that some schools are embracing full use of it for assessment in some cases, and others are banning it altogether. So yeah, I can appreciate that we're all trying to figure this out, and there's a lot of noise about it at the moment. But I think sticking true to our discipline and the fundamentals of that are what will see us through what is, as Bernie's pointed out, something that's quite a terrifying, a threat to our discipline and the way that it's taught and understood by our students. But I think that it also means that we have, our role is more important than ever, rather than being diminished. And I'm certainly not ready to relinquish, control of my classroom over to ChatGPT or any of these AI models yet, or ever, hopefully. But I've got here that, I can appreciate that many people are using AI for what we'll refer to as the plumbing of our job, which is time consuming, and it can make things easier. But I sort of want to focus on sort of protecting the poetry of our profession. And that is that we are the curators of our classroom, and that's a huge responsibility. And I think something that AI can't do yet is replicate that curatorial judgment that we have. We are the ones who decide how the syllabus come alive. And we've all seen some pretty, dull syllabus dot points in our time, I imagine. And it's our job to bring them to life. And we do that through selecting great stories, great sources, and centering perspectives that encourage conversation and historically sound as well. So I think that is our role. And I think that, it's something that's more important than ever. But I think, aside from all of the seriously unethical dimensions to AI and its use in a history classroom, I think that one thing that it also does is really flatten history and flatten the story. And it might be polished, but I think it is boring. And I sort of got an example here of, I just chucked in a prompt of, what are the most engaging or most exciting aspects of teaching World War I to Year 9? And look, some of those things you might be like, hold on, that's actually really exciting. And sure, the list here that's on the screen, but there's a danger there of them maybe being tropey or just glancing at that. It's very male. It might be playing into some myth making. And really, our job is to challenge those positions. And I think that is, where we've still got the edge on AI potentially. And I want to speak really briefly about the power of a great story as not being something that's frivolous or just like a passion project in our rooms. I think we can all think of those anecdotes or great stories or characters within our syllabus that does bring the story to life. And I think that is sound pedagogically, the use and the deployment of a great story. And I love this quote by Daniel Willingham in Why Don't Students Like School? His work's been featured really heavily in that teaching walkthroughs book series. Tom Sherrington having a bit of a moment, I think sort of rightly in education at the moment, draws heavily on a lot of his work. And he says that the human mind seems exquisitely tuned to understand and remember stories. So much so that psychologists sometimes refer to stories as psychologically privileged, meaning that they are treated differently in memory than other types of material. And I think that, our job is picking those stories. I've got some pictures there of one of my favourite stories that I came across in Northeast Arnhem Land with the Yolngu people, which was this incredible story that was everywhere up there in art. You can see in pottery, but also told by people of this trade relationship that they had with the Macassans from, what's modern day Indonesia for hundreds of years prior to colonization, and this extensive trade network that was set up. And hearing that story, I've been able to bring it back to my classroom and my programming in so many different ways and use it to reflect alternative, historical perspectives or voices that may have been previously silenced. And it's been incredibly useful, and the kids dig it. So I think that finding those stories is really key, and that's our It's our role. And I think that's sort of a case here for the Stage 5 textbook, where I think all of us, in the face of this dullness from AI, have really searched to find great stories, and great stories that maybe disrupt narratives that can be maybe detrimental or don't promote that critical thinking that we're hoping for. And I think, I've got a couple of examples up here. The Making a Nation for the new syllabus is now looped in with World War I. And, there's some great stories in there about, I guess, these erased contributors to nation building, South Sea Islanders or Japanese pearlers. And I think picking these and curating these, it complicates familiar narratives, and it prompts our students to ask questions about who disappears when history is compressed into those really polished, perfect one-sentence ChatGPT responses. Another example, the Commonwealth Franchise Act, talking about transforming moments that have the potential to be dull, policy that shaped a nation. But there's actually a really great story in here of, this very brief moment where it was on the table that all people, Aboriginal women included in Australia, would have the right to vote. And it was just this discussion or lack thereof and brief moment where that was turned down. And it sort of brings to life these sliding door moments in our own history where, something else could have been possible. And of course, the Lovett brothers, which is a great example of the injustice faced by First Nations soldiers when they returned from serving in war to find that their land had been redistributed to other soldiers. So I think that they're just some examples from the textbook of me exercising, and all of us exercising, that curatorial judgment that's so crucial for the survival of our subject and the young people that we are teaching and who are hopefully asking questions of us. And I guess just something else to consider in the Australian context is that AI itself, we know that it's plagued with all of these ethical issues, but one of them, if we're considering it through this First Nations lens, is that technology is not neutral, and it reflects the assumptions of the systems that built it. And I think it does have, and you probably can attest to this if you've played around with it, it does have it's built on these very Western definitions of knowledge and intelligence. And I think that in itself can be incredibly problematic. And there's a risk there of repeating old patterns that I think we've worked really hard in this discipline to dismantle, like extracting knowledge without permission. You can see an example there of AI artwork that's been produced, completely ripped off, extracted with that, without any knowledge of the story, or like the protocols that sort of govern First Nations art in different regions. So I think that, again, it flattens these complex, multidimensional cultural and knowledge systems into something that, at worst is, flattening, but at the very worst excludes First Nations voices and decisions about their own history again. So I think that in that sense, we have a duty in our classrooms to be really careful if we are plugging things or wanting First Nations histories or stories out of our AI, whoever you may be using or whatever system you might be using. And I think the questions that are coming out of this are questions that we as a discipline, I think, are really well equipped to answer with our students. It's about who creates knowledge and whose voice is included and whose voice is missing. And I think we have the tools to answer those questions. And that's why what we do is probably more important now than ever in exercising that curatorial judgment. But I'll hand over to Alex now. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. Given the prevalence of AI that we've been talking about, many teachers and educational institutions, I think, have accepted that very little can be done about its use. I know a lot of schools, the discussion at the moment is the use of AI within assessment tasks and how we actually assess what students know, and where we draw the line with that. And with little ability to accurately determine if students have actually used AI, many have come to simply acknowledge that it will be used and we just need to move on with the times. And I think, as Rachael and Bernie have mentioned, to an extent that's true. We live in a new world, but as secondary educators, we enter this vocation to share a passion for our subject areas, and to walk alongside our students as they grow in their knowledge and their academic skills that will help them flourish beyond the supports of school. And we have a role of supporting students as well through the HSC and its specific conditions and peculiarities that it may be. There's currently no AI generative tools that students can use in their exams. And so we're preparing them for something where they're not able to use that AI. Overuse of AI and a reliance on it by our students is concerning because use of AI is encouraging young people to jump straight to the final product without understanding the process or developing skills of analysis and inquiry, and without growing in their ability to crucially consider their own ideas in light of considered research and evidence. And so in this world of AI and misinformation, these things are even more pertinent, as Bernie was mentioning, for history teachers in preserving the historical record and considered, diligent approaches to history, where evidence guides conclusions rather than being an afterthought or rather than being manipulated to suit our purpose or perspective. And so I think the classroom, therefore, actually poses a really unique opportunity where we can be modelling the value of historical inquiry and in a controlled environment where the teacher can determine how much AI is used. Maybe we can call the classroom the final frontier. So this idea that maybe for at least the time being, we can focus on developing student skills and understanding that will provide foundational knowledge that's crucial to recognising the value of independent, rigorous historical investigation. And this will then help to build capacity for students to then use AI more critically as a tool where relevant, rather than as the first and easiest option. And so this afternoon, I'd like to highlight two strategies I think that will be important as we equip our students to think like historians, to be analytical and diligent academically in a world of AI. And so the first is capitalising on students' interest. And the second is using the classroom to model rigorous historical inquiry. And I'm going to use some of the new depth study, The Rights and Freedoms of Australian Women, with some elements from the new Oxford chapter to illustrate these points. It's always been important as teachers to harness the interests of our students. And in the context of pervasive AI, seeking to work with student interests and flame their passions, I think, is really important. The usual strategies that I know we all use, like building rapport, knowing students' hobbies and strengths, being active in the school community to build relationships outside of the classroom, listening well, providing specific praise and feedback, and modelling the joy of learning. They're always important. But we also have a really valuable opportunity at the moment with the implementation of the new syllabus to be rethinking the pattern of study, the materials, the activities, and the assessment to effectively cater for a new generation of learners. And in this context, here are a couple of thoughts to help spark, hopefully, and develop student interest in history. So in this new syllabus context, we have capacity to rethink the depth studies that we teach as that new syllabus is implemented. And it's important, I think, to consider these options and to balance teacher and student interest and also their knowledge in this selection. So, for example, it might be even worth considering a complete shift in the depth study that's been traditionally taught at your school to maybe cater to the current students that you have. For example, there's some new options like the new women topic in stage 5 that might address some of the needs or the interests of your students. And of course, within these new core studies and depth studies for each stage, we have the capacity to delve into a case study and a site study that is really up to the discretion of the teacher rather than mandated by the syllabus. And that choice allows us to work with our students' interests, maybe even involving them in the selection process. And so in selecting your case studies and your site studies, I think it's important as well that we're thinking about the area that we live in, the excursions, the sites maybe that are available to you, because getting students to explore history outside of a textbook is so powerful in developing interest and engagement and a real understanding that is away from AI. So for example, I work at a selective girls' high school. Our building's heritage listed, we have extensive archives, And I think it could make for quite a fascinating case study in this Rights and Freedoms of Australian Women topic, because it would allow students to work with real sources, maybe even develop a final work that could be displayed or used in the promotion of the school. And so I wonder what your local area offers that you could build a case study or a site study around. And I think this focus on local or personal history is a really great method to engage students and to tackle AI, given that much local or personal history isn't available in AI databases. So again, in thinking about the experiences of women in the workplace post-World War II, it would make for such a rich task to have students talk with women they know who have had these experiences, particularly women that worked during the 19th century. Imagine if all 30 students spoke with one woman each and recorded their experiences. It would make for a really fascinating source bank of a variety of different experiences. And it would be really interesting to be contributing to commemorating and remembering experiences of individuals with women who had lived experience in this struggle for rights and freedoms. And I think a task like this could really work to secure student imagination and engagement. And I think it could certainly be adapted to suit a range of different contexts. Another strategy that I've found helpful in building student interest is telling and investigating individual stories, as Rachel was mentioning. And students, they're often so engaged by personal testimonies, right? Because they allow them to connect with that material in an empathetic manner, as well as intellectually. And so in the Stage 5 Rights and Freedoms of Australian Women topic, there's 2 syllabus points specifically that ask students to directly explore the role of at least one individual in the fight for rights and freedoms for Australian women. One's prior to World War II and the other is after. And there's just so many fascinating options that can be explored here. There's Edith Cowan, Vita Goldstein, Germaine Greer, Mel Thornton, Elizabeth Reed, a variety of women that had economic experiences or political experiences. And their stories really work to highlight the discrimination that women experience, the methods that were used to make change, and also some of the challenges and tensions in the development of women's rights. Seeking out those conversations and debates that appeared in the past can be a really great conversation starter, even today, because some of those tensions and experiences still remain relevant in today's climate. And so I think moments where the past and present interact, they're often emotionally charged, and told through a story, students can become really deeply invested. So for example, the story of Emmeline Pankhurst is a really interesting personality to delve deeply into. And perhaps in a case study, there's a bit of a foundation for one provided in the New Oxford chapter. Her story is just inherently interesting. She fits specifically into the early section of the new syllabus as students consider the development of universal suffrage movements. And her activism in seeking to secure female suffrage is mostly contextualised in the UK, but she has connections and involvement in a whole range of other nations like the US and Australia. And so it helps to facilitate her story as being a mechanism to tell a broader international story of this suffrage movement. She's a public figure, and again, we don't always want to be talking about public figures, but for our juniors, I think it often is really valuable that we're using rich primary sources where there are perspective, there's clear ideas. And Emmeline Pankhurst is a great one because there are so many sources about her ideology. You can see change in her own methods across the course of her life, and there's big questions that can be asked there. And it's also in that context of the suffragettes in the UK who were so controversial at the time. And a lot of their protest methods that were controversial then have had enduring relevance as they're being used today as well. So you've got that connection today, which I think makes the story really interesting. It makes for a rich and emotionally engaging historical investigation. And so the second strategy I'd like to highlight in considering how we approach history in our classrooms in this world of AI is to harness the classroom as a place of historical inquiry, a place where we can model this process and in doing that work of a historian together in a controlled way in which the teacher manages how much AI is used, hopefully the important skill of historical investigation and analysis will be taught, but also hopefully the value of this work will be taught too. AI responses are quite notorious for poor use of sources and for confecting them, for not including them, for incorporating sources not necessarily as the foundation, but just because you've asked them to. And therefore, we have really important work to do in highlighting to our students where to find these quality sources, to assess the value of those sources, and then to be able to actually synthesize all of those ideas to form conclusions. And so a couple of brief thoughts here on rich source use in the history classroom to highlight the value and the use and analysis of sources. I think it's really important that we're constantly redirecting students to historical evidence in our classroom practice. For example, I think it's imperative that we're vigilantly and constantly asking questions of our students when they make claims. So, but why? How much? How do you know that? What's an example to support that? Is that always true? Can you think of examples where that's not true? It's also important, I think, that we're having discussions about the need for evidence and the use and the misuse of evidence. So raising some of the current examples, like what Bernie was mentioning earlier, about evidence and about the problems with it, can help bring some of those ideas to the forefront for students so they can see relevance today. And I'm also particularly passionate about making repetition and recall fun and a regular part of the process of historical inquiry to keep redirecting students back to historical evidence. They can't make considered judgments if they don't know the material and they don't remember the sources that they've investigated. And so constant repetition of these, using sources multiple times in different ways, I think can help establish a foundation of knowledge that's based on evidence, and then they'll be able to inform that critical evaluation. And if we want to show to students that evidence is important to support assertions, we need to be selecting and using quality historical sources that have been contextualized when we're in the classroom. Sources that allow for rigorous historical discussion, such as with a clear perspective or bias, and sources that have demonstrable provenance are going to be most valuable in teaching this skill for younger years. So a really interesting body of evidence for the rights and freedoms of Australian women topic is the Australian Women's Weekly. I found looking at the editions from before World War I, during World War I, and then World War II, and then after World War II, provided really interesting insight into the changing social values and the attitudes towards women, including showing attitudes towards women at home and in the workforce and how the war changed that, or didn't change that. And this body of evidence provides the ability to explore these changing beliefs with rich written sources and visual sources, and the capacity to further investigate the authors and contributors. I think when we're thinking about assessing quality of sources and the provenance of sources, being able to actually research the author and the contributor and getting students to do that, to find where their sources come from, is a really important part of the historical practice. Evaluating sources, we know, is a really important outcome of all of our syllabuses, particularly clearly needed when we're writing Stage 6 source-based written responses. But focus on this isn't just to teach students how to write source-directed answers, but rather through this lens of teaching students how to critically consider sources. And I think when I'm thinking about sources in the classroom and analysing sources in the classroom, my approach is pretty restricted sometimes to how to structure responses, how to answer specific questions, rather than seeing the reasoning, the deeper reasoning for why we're asking students to analyse these sources in the first place. And that, of course, as history teachers and historians, is to develop their critical thinking and their rigorous approach to evidence. And so finally, as we're thinking about the classroom as a place where historical inquiry is practiced, perhaps consideration of some use of AI as a tool on occasion in the classroom to help model good practice of AI is valuable. So, for example, I work at a department school. They have EduChat, and it's a tool that's designed to break down questions or tasks rather than to provide answers. So, you know, if students are struggling with breaking down questions or tasks, if they're constantly needing your direction to do this, these tools might be helpful. It allows students, gives them capacity and agency in order to be doing that themselves when they're not in the classroom with you. But I'd be helping students to be gradually releasing their reliance on these tools so that they're actually learning that skill of breaking down questions themselves rather than always relying on AI to do so. You know, encouraging students, I think, to be basing their assertions on evidence and knowledge is really important, because students don't have the same knowledge as AI databases. So the evaluations that AI provides might not actually fit the evidence that you've taught them in class, evidence that they have access to. And that's not always a bad thing either. I think teaching students that perspective is important. We're historians, we all have different interpretations of things, and that's going to be based on the evidence that we have access to. And we wanted them to be building that skill. Sometimes diverging interpretations and evaluations, they're not always problematic if they're based on good quality evidence. You know, if a student has issues with expression and grammar, I think you could be encouraging them maybe to use AI sometimes to be highlighting phrases or wording that needs correcting. But rather than copying output, I think encouraging students to identify what changes were made and considering why those changes were made. We also want students to be rereading the response to make sure that the meaning hasn't changed, it so often can. and encouraging students maybe just to pull out a couple of changes and to be using those principles themselves rather than just passively accepting the changes. It's the sort of approach that I would encourage when I'm editing students' work or getting them to think through things. My suggestions aren't always better. It doesn't necessarily always tell the story that the student wants to put forward. And so, yeah, not encouraging them to not just passively accept changes that AI provides, I think is really important. And students often have this mindset that AI responses are better than whatever they would write, and I think that is really demotivating for a lot of students, particularly those that struggle, or particularly those that don't really enjoy history. And to counter this, I think maybe you could generate some AI responses and get students to blind mark them, maybe in relation to some criteria. And then depending on quality, depending what you have access to, you could mark some anonymous student responses too. And I think you'll actually see, maybe you've selected well, that while AI responses might read well, the quality of information, the depth of sources, the historical richness, and that detailed understanding isn't always there. And I think through that discussion, you could highlight how students' own responses, even if they aren't maybe as neat grammatically, are often better. And in this, I'd also be highlighting as well that in building evaluations and arguments, voice is so important. Their own phrasing, their word choice, their selection of sources and evidence are key parts of building responses that are actually meaningful and insightful. And so consequently, I wonder if it's worth reframing our approach to teaching history in the classroom in a world of AI as a space where we have control and capacity to highlight the importance of the work of a historian that can't be done well by an AI tool. And this rigorous evaluative approach to sourcing, to evaluating evidence, to drawing conclusions within the history maker's own context is valuable in providing new perspectives, and also being able to authentically and critically consider other historical works. Building student interest, sustaining it, as well as treating the history classroom as a place to model historical inquiry is so valuable in teaching students skills that will help them be lifelong learners and to judiciously and intelligently engage with the world around them, to hopefully see that value in the process of inquiry and not just immediately reaching for the final product.
Great. Okay, should we move into the Q&A? Yeah. Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. And honestly, I think, Alex, you might have already answered a couple of the questions that we got just through your part. So if anyone does have any questions, please pop them in the chat. Okay. We've got a question from Erin on, she's wondering if any of you have encountered tools or resources that can assist students in being critical about the images and videos they are confronted with that are promoted as true history.
I think, and Alex, you spoke to this, I think if anything, it's like double down on what we do, and that is evaluate sources, you know. Historians have always had the task of verifying, and I think that now more than ever, it's just ramping that up in our classrooms. You know, everyone has their own potentially acronyms or tools or tables, like scaffolds for evaluating source material. But really, it's just, if we can treat it just as another source that we as the historian are verifying and evaluating, I think that that's we just treat it like any other source would be my answer to that. What do you guys think?
And I think too, there's also that capacity to place the kids in the role of historians dealing with these things that historians are going to have to deal with. That's why I wanted to use that new one that Trump put out the other day, because there's a classic example of, we have a cultural understanding of who the people were in that video. So we know they were superheroes and whatever. An historian in the future won't have that. So getting kids to look at something like that that's at the moment very controversial or contemporary, and say, well, how is an historian going to have to, what's an historian going to have to do? What are the steps they'll have to go through in the future to work out what this is? Because they won't have our contemporary knowledge to do that. And I think that reinforces exactly what both Rachael and Alex were saying, that you're putting the kids in that position of doing the work and being the historians and thinking about what they're seeing and developing the tools to feel comfortable in what they're doing, and that they're going to be right. Getting that self-belief, I think, is really important with students.
Great. Okay, and we have another question. So Peter is wondering, some students use AI to mark their responses. Is this a good idea?
That's an interesting one. My initial thoughts are, I haven't actually asked AI to mark responses, but what I would be thinking about there is there's so much that goes on when you're marking student responses. You're looking at specific criteria. You're looking, particularly when you're marking something that's classwork or work that's based on what you've done in class, you're marking it based on what you've taught them and what you know your students know. And so I really worry what AI is going to be marking that response on, what they're prioritizing. There is a lot of interpretation that comes in when we are marking things. Look, would it sometimes give good advice when it comes to rephrasing and expressing things differently, to, getting some ideas about structure? Sure, maybe, but I think that always has to be looked at through the student's own lens, through what they know, through what they've been taught, and within those very specific requirements as well, particularly when we're talking senior years, of the syllabus and what they're going to be asked to answer there. I don't think AI is always going to have those foundations and those frameworks at the forefront, of its marking.
I was going to add to that. I mean, I have chucked a few things through there, and it's just not very good. Again, it's broad. It's not really, what you're looking for. And if you're given a task that's requiring a mark or requiring feedback, there's purpose in that, whether that's for us finding out where they're at or for them. I think for it to be specific, targeted, for it to do the work that you want feedback to do, I haven't found that it's very useful. But I think it speaks to the point that Alex was saying before as well about this academic self-concept, and that ChatGPT has all the answers. It's better than me. It's smarter than me, and if they're just saying, or if they're checking everything that they do, they're losing that confidence in them, potentially you. And then where does that leave us? And it's giving them or leading them down this path that maybe is wrong. And then we have to do the work of going in and correcting that and course correcting the feedback. And, so I think that of course, it can be helpful, again, for these guardrails, a bit of the plumbing of the work. But I think it could set you on a dangerous path potentially, which will require more work and, maybe not a great outcome for students. But I can see the value in doing it for check these facts or check that, even that these days. But, I can see the value in those lower level things. But, I would avoid that personally.
Next, we have a question from Rebecca. There's actually a couple questions on this kind of theme, but do you have any suggestions on how to give students take-home assessments, but to limit or remove the use of AI? And any recommendations for creating AI-proof assessment tasks that aren't in-class tasks?
I don't know about you, Alex, but we've had to redesign most of our assessments. It has required a huge rethink. Look, the take-home element for us has had to be now about process, check-ins, and we've had then a lot of our assessments that they bring whatever that process is into an in-class task. I was just on playground duty today, and I saw a kid with a worksheet, and he had his laptop open, and he was just copying answers straight from ChatGPT onto a worksheet, and I thought, God, what's the point of that? That person's got to mark that homework maybe, So, I think we're all dealing with this issue at the moment. For us, what we've done is we've made them process assessments, that check-ins, and we've had to think creatively about different ways into questions or skills that maybe are AI-proof-ish for now.
Yeah, I'd agree. Particularly, I think there's still, as I was mentioning, I think there still is value in tasks that are getting students to research, that are getting them to think about a question deeply and find their own evidence. And you can't do that well in an exam. There's still space in our junior syllabuses and in our, I know that the assessments aren't necessarily mandated anymore in year 11 and 12, but that historical investigation for year 11, I think, is so valuable because that is the work of a historian. And so I really worry about moving all assessment tasks to in-class, exam-based things. It doesn't provide that capacity for students developing interest and for them to actually be giving them the time and space to be thinking critically. And so I think, look, it's tricky and potentially maybe it will move even more towards those things as time goes on, as the world progresses. But I think for now, as Rachel was saying, we've also had that focus on ensuring that we have access to students' documents, that we're doing progress checks to see where they're at, that we're having, even informal conversations with them, almost like a log of their work in some way, whether it's written or verbally, so we can be seeing how their thoughts are changing over time. And that means that even if they are using AI to sort of structure some bits or get some ideas occasionally, we're still encouraging them to use other sources. We're still checking, bibliographies and seeing that they've used real quality, academic evidence, and that we've been working with them to see that progress of the task over time. And in some ways, as educators, that is what we should be doing anyway. We shouldn't just be setting a task and letting them do it themselves. We should be supporting students through it. So, that is something to be thinking about, I suppose, as we are providing those research, maybe tasks that might be done a little bit more at home than directly in class.
We've also been building in, and an idea is to build into the marking criteria, that the quality of that conversation and how legitimate that conversation was. I mean, we have professional judgment on that. We know when they're making it up, or it may have deferred to ChatGPT even to have that conversation. I think we can still do that. So yeah, putting a bit of weight behind that in the criteria can be a helpful tool to use as well.
Nice. Okay, and we've got actually quite a few questions. So Andrew's wondering, how can we design tasks where AI enhances thinking without replacing the student's own historical interpretation?
I mean, yeah, look, it's here. We have to think about that. It changes access and speed to information, right? So that potentially can be something that you can use to your advantage. Even these research tasks, like the quality. I don't know if anyone's seen the South Park episode on that. I'm exposing myself a little bit there, but all of a sudden the teacher has these essays and they have this, incredibly high standard, and I think that potentially maybe we can, if we are facing it head on, we're saying you do have access to historiography or historians' perspectives that you then have to go and double check or triple check, whatever it is, triangulate. There's an expectation that it's a little bit, the quality is there. I know that a few of my students have done that with for the IB, the internal assessment, or the HI. They've used it to find out what these historians' positions are, what their works are, what books they should go to, and I think that can be helpful, so long as that's the first step and not the final step. But it's a tough one. I don't know. We're trying to work that out as well.
Yeah, I've had the first time last year where I was asked as a question at a talk I was giving for HSC students, and they said, well, how do we use it to study? And as I said, in history, nothing has changed in the sense that if you're using it as a source for any information, it's still exactly the same as if you're getting it out of a book or watched a film or whatever. Our responsibility is to give them those skills and make sure that they apply them in exactly the same way. It's not, they can't see it as the easy answer to everything. It's just another source when all's said and done. And I think that's what we've got to keep in mind with all of this as we go through with any tasks and how they respond to tasks, that it's really important that they just treat it as a source and have to evaluate its use and all those questions we ask of sources.
We are getting close to time, but is everyone happy to answer a couple more questions before we wrap up?
Mm.
Cool. Yeah, cool. Okay. So we've got a question from David on how do you mediate historical reenactors such as AI Cleopatra and other figures as discussed by Sal Khan? Do you see any possibility of utilizing them in the history classroom, or is there like the problem of AI hallucinations and the anachronistic views that they have?
Well, I find myself getting drawn in on YouTube to all sorts of weird and wonderful things like that. And my thought on it is that how I would have been using that in the classroom is because I really think anything that stimulates kids' interest and imagination is incredibly valuable. But that then comes back round to, well, how do we know it's accurate? Use it to draw them in, but they've still got to apply the same thing to that because they know it's not real. And say, well, okay, let's spend a lesson deconstructing it once you're interested in it because they want to know, and then say, oh, that's how it's put together. Because a lot of it is really good. It gives you that sense of being there, which is what we try to do with our lessons all the time. It's my
I was going to say, yeah, no, I think the same thing. It can be really cool. And I think that in that way, like we've all probably played the dud video here and there that like probably when you're watching it, you're like, God, the historical accuracy of that's a little questionable. I just put it in that, but was it funny or interesting? And like you said, does it capture their imagination? Does it allow them to picture something that they couldn't before? But I think that the principle just has to be step one. It's not the end. We're not just taking that now as, well, that's exactly how the pyramids were built because I saw an AI video of it, it's just another thing for us to investigate. Although I was devastated that the bunnies jumping on the trampoline wasn't real. That one got me. Devastated.
And I think as well, sources like that, they do open that conversation. It's a great source to use for, practicing a value and limitations sort of question. What are the values and limitations of this sort of source, and those bigger questions on use of evidence and where we go. A source like that is so engaging, that has that sort of entertainment factor, that visual factor to it, but then it does allow you to kind of pull back and students can use their knowledge then to maybe assess and critique where some of the historical inaccuracies were as well. I think would actually make for a rich task on a discussion beyond just what the content of the topic is.
And what do you all think of the use of generative AI as a revision tool for students?
Yeah, I can be into it. I've actually seen it done really well. But again, I think that the important thing to remember is what it produces is so contingent on the quality of the prompt. So again, really high-flying kids that know how to prompt and know how to get the most out of it, they'll benefit. And just like, on the flip side of that, could be really unhelpful or not, or not fair even for kids that might struggle with that. So I think, yeah, it's a great tool if you know how to use it for revising, or refining, drawing out those key pieces of evidence from your own notes or organizing your notes or something like that. But again, that raises questions about, is that something we now have to teach? Are we going to have to, what do we have to sacrifice to make room for teaching that? Do we want to do that? So I think, again, complicated, but I think it can be really useful for kids that know how to work it.
Yeah, and I guess adding on to that, great maybe for those that can work it and those that can't. I've seen students sort of bring essay questions to me that they've practiced writing a response to. And I said, where did you get that question from? And they'll say, from AI. And I thought, yeah, but we'd never ask that for a wide range of reasons. There might be 6 different components to it, and they're a year 8 student or even a senior student. We think that's just not a question that would ever be asked for a variety of reasons. And it's the same thing if you were just using it for testing knowledge. The sorts of questions that it's throwing out might actually not be helpful for the skills that students need in that particular task, and how well are they going to prompt it to know the specific requirements of this specific exam that's coming up, or whatever it might be. You worry then that it's directing students that it hasn't heard, what's our role of the teacher is to bring history to life. We're telling stories. Not everything is written down in the textbook. Not all the skills are written down in students' class notes. So even if they're putting that into AI, that there's stuff that's written, all of that other content that's going on in the classroom, all those skills we're teaching them about, AI doesn't have those in the same way. And so I do wonder, the way that it's directing students to then revise their notes and the sorts of content that it's getting them to learn, could also be problematic.
Okay, should we do one more and then, okay, so last question for the day is how useful is the AI traffic light system in assessment task design? If you have any thoughts on that.
The traffic light system, I think there's a few different versions of this, like full AI in the research process. Yeah, I mean, similar to what we said before, I think when you name it, it becomes less like, ooh, to the kids as well. If you're like, you can use AI to, like, in the research phase, it's less like, I'm doing something bad. And it's like, we know it's there. We know you use it. And it can maybe take the heat out of it slightly. But yeah, I haven't had much experience with like a full, I assume green light means that you can use it in full, or like you can just use it. So I'm not sure, but I think there's value in naming it and saying it's here rather than like, we can't push out the tide, and then teaching hopefully a bit of restraint or putting some guardrails for students to deal, to implement it. But yeah, not sure about the traffic lights.
Yeah, I would agree. Just I suppose just in light of what I guess the position of the speakers today has been, is that idea that teaching students skills outside of AI is so valuable. And so I would be really pushing against, I think, in assessment tasks, giving students, the okay to fully use AI for everything. That defeats the purpose of the work of a historian. And again, like with any source, like we've mentioned, it needs to be used well and used critically. And so identifying to students, sure, this is an okay use in this task, and this is an okay use in this task, and for the process of history and constructing history, I think that is valuable. But yeah, like anything, I think we need to be giving students guidance and bounds there as to what is okay for us and within our school context too.
Yeah, I think the bottom line things, it's all got to go through the kid's head.
Yeah.
They've got to be able to deal with it. They've got to have some input and discerning what's right, what's wrong, I think if we lose that, we can't. The only skill that kids have is to look up something and get someone else to spew it out. That's not what we can do in the classroom. Our job is to get those kids to always be thinking for themselves. I know that's very strongly the theme the books that we've been working on have all been trying to do, is drive kids to think for themselves and find stories that are interesting, characters that are interesting in history, and giving teachers this material to say, right, let the kids go and see what they can make of this, because ultimately that's what they've got to do if they're going to succeed in anything in school, is to be able to do it for themselves. But I'm old, so.
You're wonderful, and I agree.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, everyone. I'm sure everyone watching can agree that we have some really smart, insightful authors here. So yeah, thank you again. And we do have, if you did want to find out more about Oxford's new history resources for stage 4 and 5, you can scan the QR code,